to start, I thought, this is a science communication department. I'll articulate why science communication, and in particular why I think science communication is important. And then talk a little bit about the research I've done in collaboration with the American Society for Microbiology on this issue of microbiomes. That is an emerging issue that has a lot of implications for human health and the environment. So, if this would work, why science communication, and articulating in particular why that's important to study. And I understand that about 2/3 of you are bench scientists, correct? Maybe? And you're clearly here because there's a science comm minor and you believe in the importance of science communication. So hopefully this will help you tell grandma or uncle why, right? But in the United States, at least, factual knowledge of science is pretty limited. And we have very limited frameworks for understanding new scientific information. The statistics that you'll see on the slide are from a National Science Board report that comes out every 2 years, I believe. And Chapter 7 is devoted to public attitudes towards science and public understanding of science. So, in the last one that came out in 2016, they found that 53% of Americans can define randomized experiments. And if you're kind of an optimist like Dietram, then you're like, yes, that's great. Half of America can define what a randomized experiment is. But only 26% understand the concept of a scientific study, right? And again, if you're half full, you're like, okay, almost a third, good, we're making progress. But part of the problem is that we're not really paying that much attention to science. Not that many of us in the US are that interested in keeping up with science news, right? And the problem is that now in media, we're very, very distracted. Everybody loves this slide. But it's true, there's a lot of things going on that are, aside from cats, but I am a cat person, and so, there's a lot of things that draw our attention away from issues of politics, issues of public affairs, and even more so issues of science.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah, let's keep looking at the previous slide. And actually, as I go through this, I welcome you to ask any questions, and feel free to stop me and ask. I'm happy to answer questions. This one's so cute. Anyway. But so the other thing is that most of us don't learn science in the classroom, right? So this is a figure from a piece in the American Scientist that shows lifespan in years on the x-axis. We have time of day on the y, and then the months of the year. And it basically is showing us how much time we spend in formal education, K through 12, and then college. And a lot of that is not necessarily science education, right? Science education is sort of the small, dripping syringe that enters into that. And also, only 30% of US adults will ever take one science course, right? And so science education is not the place necessarily where a lot of us get information and news about science. The rest of the space is really filled by media, right? And especially online media now. We know that most audiences are turning online for information about science and technology. Again, here's these data from the National Science Board, right? And in 2014, this is for specific science and technology issues, but for specific issues in science and technology, in 2014, 2/3 of the American public went online for that information, right? The highest ever percentage reported. And so, unfortunately, what we still see are these gaps in public opinion and opinions of scientists. So these are data from Pew Research Center. And it's data collected on scientists, AAAS scientists of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and with all the caveats that comes with, right? The AAAS sample, I don't know if you guys have talked about this, but some of us are scientists who are part of AAAS, right? But also people who are science communicators. And it's not just exclusively who we think of as scientists, people who produce knowledge, right? Work at a lab bench, collect field data. But we see, wide disparities in opinion on scientific issues between American adults generally, and also between them and scientists, right? And on a variety of different issues: climate change, GMOs, vaccines. And so we have this really big opinion gap, right, between publics and experts. And recently, sort of AAAS, Science, Nature, there have been articles about being able to bridge this opinion gap and the importance of bridging this opinion gap to the scientific endeavor in the US and globally. And so my little contribution to this is a part about microbiomes. And microbiomes are an emerging issue, right? You've probably all heard a little bit about the human microbiome. There's a lot about it in the news about obesity and how that might contribute to obesity and how your gut microbes might even contribute to your mood, right? Affecting your mood. But basically what microbiomes are communities of microorganisms that live, come on in, no worries, that live in various ecosystems and very diverse ecosystems, right? So collections of bacteria, archaea, and things like that live on plants and soils, in marine and freshwater systems, and even in the atmosphere, and even in the built environment, right? All around us, there are microbes on everything we have. Anybody who has worked in a microbiology lab knows this because sterile techniques are a pain in the butt. But in any case, these microbiomes and the microbes that constitute them have a lot of implications for human health. Right? We just talked a little bit about obesity and mood alteration, climate change. A lot of microbes in surface oceans cycle carbon and contribute to that carbon cycle. And as well as food security, right? A lot of talk about soil microbiomes in agriculture. And so why did I choose this? As Dominique has mentioned, I have a master's degree in oceanography, and I actually worked with microbiomes before they put the term microbiomes to it. We just called it microbial community dynamics, which is basically a lot of sequencing DNA from surface waters, and that's what I work with. So a lot of filtering water, and I actually came to the University of Wisconsin as a PhD student in engineering, in environmental engineering, and I was going to study aquatic ecosystems in, UW has a field station up north in northern Wisconsin, and we do a lot of freshwater work up there. But along the way, I ended up here, and now I'm working in science communication, obviously. But so recently, there have been sort of impetuses to think about more global and national microbiome initiatives. And actually, some of these pieces, the co-author on these pieces is from the University of Wisconsin, Margaret McFall-Nye. She's just in that building over there, and she studies bacteria and surface waters as well. But thinking about how to understand, right, and better use the microbiomes that we encounter in daily life, because they are everywhere, right, and creating an effort and an initiative toward this. And in some of these pieces, there's a call for the integration of social scientists as well, right, to sort of preemptively think about the risks and to assess these risks and address them, which, in science communication, we understand that's really important. But it's nice to see, right, that bench scientists and field scientists are also recognizing the importance of social science, especially on an issue that affects society more broadly. And so in 2016, Joe Handelsman, also formerly of the University of Wisconsin, sorry?
She's back.
Oh, she's back? She's back. Oh, she's back. Should have done the research on that. But in 2016, she was the science advisor, right, from the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And she announces the National Microbiome Initiative. And there are a lot of different foundation funders involved in it, right, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example. And so there's this big push to study more about the microbiome, to understand, to move from describing the microbiome to actually understanding the functioning of microbiomes and how they, right, influence human health and the environment. But also for social scientists, right, communication scholars, science communication scholars, to think about how this might fit into society more broadly. And, if it's any indication, we're going online for information about microbiomes. I did a quick little search for the term microbiome and recorded the volume of search terms, right, the volume of hits over the years. And you can see that there's a pretty exponential increase in the last couple of years, right, of people searching for microbiomes. And part of this is because, well, the human microbiome has become a really big topic of conversation. So, right. So in 2015, I actually attended a conference here in Madison, the National Alliance for Broader Impacts. And I met the communications director from the American Society of Microbiology, and she's really interested, because microbiomes is sort of the topic du jour, she's very interested in thinking more about, well, what people are encountering in media about microbiomes, right? They really had no idea about this, and how people think and form their attitudes toward this. And having been a microbiologist, not loving the filtering water or the extraction of DNA, but really enjoying science communication, I sort of jumped at the opportunity to help her understand some of these things. And so what we started with was trying to see, well, what are people encountering, right, when they go online for information about microbiomes? So what does coverage of microbiomes in online media generally look like? And to start, we thought, well, let's focus on where the implications in online articles are, right? The implications of microbiomes in online articles. What are people writing about? What's being covered? And so we thought about, well, is it human health or medicine? Is it about animals and plants? Is it the built environment, right? Environments around us, like, and there are a lot of articles, for example, about the microbiomes that are on your phones. But then also the natural environment, right? So that's one of the things we measured was where the implications of these microbiomes lie. What is the focus of the implications? One of these four. The other thing we thought about, well, how scientific are these articles about microbiomes? And this sort of was born out of this conversation where she said, well, the one statistic that they open with, you know, that there are, I don't know, 3 times the order of magnitude microbial cells in your body than your own cells or something, and she was saying, well, that's just wrong, right, as a microbiologist. So we wanted to know about, well, how scientific are these articles that people encounter online? And so we measured a couple of things here. First of all, whether they included data, right, in the articles themselves. Do they mention investigators and researchers? Is there a scientific source, like an academic journal? And then finally, is there some mention of the process that the microbes are engaging in? Okay. So these are sort of indicators of how scientific an article is. And to accomplish this, to sort of answer that question in a very preliminary way, we conducted a content analysis over the course of 6 months. And so this is just a slide, a little bit more technical details for folks who are familiar with content analysis, but we constructed a week from every month. We ended up with about 478 articles. And we had various exclusion criteria, right? Things that were really short, so under 100 words. We only analyzed text. So anything that had videos or audios or were just shared slides, we excluded. Anything behind paywalls, we excluded, because if people are going online and searching, they're probably not paying for it, right? They're going to read whatever is open and free and freely available. And of course, any broken links were excluded. And then if you're interested in content analysis, this is a manual content analysis, right? So we had various coders and then having to establish intercoder reliability. We sort of did that on a subsample of 30, and then we have some metric of intercoder reliability. And which, you know, is good and good enough. So, less important. More interesting is what we found, right? So, I said where the focus of the implications are in these articles. We had human health, animals, the built environment, and the natural environment. And for the most part, right, we see a lot of the articles were about human health, right? Had implications about human health. And you know, if you Google microbiomes, probably one of the very first things that will come up is about obesity and the human microbiome, right? And so, you know, there are also things about antibiotic resistance, right? And so this is an example of something that has a focus of an implication that is about humans in medicine. Things about animals, right? Fruit fly larvae. This was particularly a study that came out about the scent of fruit flies and how that's associated with the bacteria in their guts. In the built environment, there's a lot about mining and how microbes can help with mitigation of toxins and heavy metals. And then in the natural environment, right, thinking about Martian volcanoes, and there's a lot of astrobiological things that go along here. The other thing we were interested in is scientific depth, right? So how scientific these articles were, and we had 4 indicators of scientific depth. We had data, we had whether there's a process, whether there were investigators included, right, and whether there's a scientific source. And so we just enumerated how many of those. And by and large, you know, 30% had at least 3 indicators of the scientific depth, right? And so, you know, they're pretty scientific articles for the most part. But what it mostly included was some mention of the investigators, right? Researcher so-and-so at this place did this study. All right, so that's great, and that's fun to look at, and interesting to get a sort of sense of what people might encounter when they go online to search for information about this topic. But what I'm really interested in, I think this battery might be dying, but is sort of public opinion and how people form opinions. Dominique had mentioned a lot of my research interest is in information seeking and information processing, right? And so, what we know about this is that as people, we use a lot of cognitive shortcuts or heuristics to form our attitudes, to form judgments about a whole variety of issues, and scientific issues is not excluded in this, right? So we know that factors such as conservatism influence how we form opinions, religiosity, partisanship, deference to scientific authority. Right? We know that all these things sort of influence how we form opinions. What is sort of less well studied is how affective influences impact our judgment and decision making and impact public opinion. We know from psychology research that it does play a role, right? So affect as sort of this broad term used for mood or emotion. And in risk communication, we know of the affect heuristic, right, where we use a positive or negative feeling about something to make judgments. There's other research about nanotechnology, right, that shows we use negative feelings in conjunction with knowledge and cognitive factors. And then also, so things like nanotechnology and nuclear energy, right? We do use emotions and mood and feelings about them in some way. So one example of this is this from this study that Dietrich was involved in, but in conjunction with a cognitive factor, right? So on the x-axis you have knowledge about nanotechnology, and then the various lines represent how negative they feel about it. We know that that cognitive factor with knowledge and that affect, that negative emotion, work together to influence how supportive people are about nanotechnology, right? So I'm just showing you one of the graphs from this piece, but it also influences how much risk people perceive in nanotechnology. So that's great, but most of the studies so far have actually operationalized, have thought of affect as sort of a general feeling, right? A positive or a negative feeling, without necessarily examining a specific, discrete emotion. And certainly there's research in communication about fear appeals, right, and anger, but the emotion that I was most interested in related to microbiomes is disgust. Disgust is a discrete emotion, it's a very basic emotion, right, and it probably evolved due to the selection pressure of pathogens. So you can see how it might be relevant then to microbes and microbiomes. In the field of communication, disgust has not been a very popular child persuasion research, as I've mentioned. It's focused mostly on anger and fear, right, and maybe guilt. But disgust has been shown to decrease support for various issues. So it does have an impact on things like animal experimentation and how you view animal experimentation. And it has a relationship with how we allocate cognitive resources to processing information, right? So like studies on disgusting images on tobacco, on cigarette boxes have shown us that, well, it changes how much cognitive effort we put toward encoding and processing that information, right? And so what I wanted to study then is sort of this relationship between disgust, a discrete emotion, and various attitudes about microbiomes. The first one that I'm going to talk about today is its impact on attitudes toward regulating microbiome research and microbiome products. And then the second one is about how it influences how we process information that subsequently forms our perceptions of risk. And so, we conducted an experiment in addition to that content analysis, and what we did, I'll just describe the experiment briefly here. But we obtained a sample from Qualtrics. If you're a comm scholar, this is not a representative sample. We used quota sampling based on the US Census Bureau, which is fine for an experiment. And then our experiment itself was a manipulation of text, a story about microbiomes that either was designed to elicit disgust or not, and then was either focused on human or non-human implications, right? And the numbers in the boxes just show the sample sizes in here. Again, this is sort of a more technical slide for the comm scholars who are like, well, what are your group sizes, right? So, random assignment, similar group sizes. There we go. And then data analysis, most of this work is done through regression methods, ordinarily least squares regression, and then I will talk about some interactions and sort of we'll walk through some of these, but a lot of these models are either moderated or some form of moderated mediation, if that makes sense to folks, again, who are mostly social science scholars here. And we can talk about those. But so, disgust and regulatory attitudes. So this is the first sort of outcome variable that I was interested in, support for regulation about microbiomes and microbiome-related products. And so the first thing, and this is sort of a manipulation check in a way, right? Did my disgust eliciting text actually work? Is that, hopefully it has some relationship to experience disgust, right, that we measured later in the survey. And that the focus has some influence on that, so whether it's human or non-human. Presumably, a human focus would increase the disgust that people experience after reading this article. And then that's related to support for regulation. Right? Disgust tends to be an emotion that allows us to censor and self-regulate. And so the hypothesis here is that greater experienced disgust tends to also increase support for regulation of microbiomes, microbiome research, and the products that are related to them. So, lots of numbers. This is the exact same model with data and coefficients. So those numbers just represent the relationships, right? Positive relationship is that, so let's take this for example. There is a positive relationship between our disgust manipulation and experienced disgust. And so, the folks who saw the disgust manipulation experienced more disgust than those who didn't. That's just all that means, right? With the issue focus, we have another significant positive relationship, and that just means that when people saw the human condition instead of the non-human condition, they were more disgusted by that, right? They experienced more disgust, which is, again, something that is expected. This here, then, is that interaction between the two manipulations, disgust and human, and sort of as we would expect, the disgust human condition would have the greatest elicitation, right, of experienced disgust, and that certainly was the case. And then, again, as hypothesized, more experienced disgust meant more support for regulation, which is what our data show. So this study is currently under review actually at Com Monographs, but I just wanted to talk about these coefficients and show you that, it's not that surprising, but if it's a human focus and you do use the text to elicit disgust, right, people do experience more disgust, but then that also influences them to increase their support for regulating these products and regulating the research around microbiomes. Right. So the second study that I want to talk about is sort of one that I'm a little more interested in because it has to do with information processing. But again, using that disgust manipulation and thinking about how that influences whether we process things in a heuristic manner or a systematic manner. Systematic processing, so in general, information processing has two modes. We have a very cognitively effortful mode of information processing. We know this by different names, right? Daniel Kahneman calls it System 1, I think. There's systematic processing, there's elaboration, right? But, so that's cognitively effortful. We try to weigh sort of all the information that is available to us to form that opinion. On the other hand, there's heuristic processing, and a heuristic is just a mental shortcut, and so this is a cognitively effortless way. It's much faster than systematic processing, right? So we use sort of mental shortcuts that help us make decisions and form judgments. And so, disgust as an emotion, I think, influences, there's evidence that disgust as an emotion influences the types of processing that we do, right? And in general, actually, it tends to increase systematic processing. Experiencing the emotion of disgust in previous research has shown that we tend to become more systematic, use more cognitive resources to process information when we encounter this. The other thing I'm interested in is, well, how does attention to information, we started this talk, right, by saying, well, we get most of our information about science online, right? So how does information in online spaces and news influence that relationship between disgust and how we process information. And then finally, how does that then feed into how we feel about the risks of microbiomes and microbiome research and the products themselves? Okay. And so again, this is a regression model. If you're familiar with sort of the statistical half part of this, you know, this is a moderated mediation, it's a conditional process model. And so, you know, what the results look like is complicated, but quite basically you have the two independent variables, right? Disgust, attention to microbiome news. You have the mediating variables, heuristic and systematic processing, and the final outcome variable of perceived risks. So let's just look at some of these significant effects here. Well, we know that there's a main effect of attention to news on systematic processing, such that the more attention you pay to news about this issue, the more likely you are to process that information systematically. That intuitively seems to make sense to us, right? And that, you know, the more systematic you are about that processing, you actually perceive more risks. For those of you interested in sort of the details of the model, we controlled for benefits as well, right? So perceived benefits of microbiomes are controlled for in here, and then controlled for demographics, such as sex, income, education. But disgust itself didn't have any influence on systematic processing, right? It's attention to news that has that influence on processing, but not disgust. Disgust, on the other hand, does influence the shorter, sort of quicker form of processing that we do, and it has a negative relationship. So those who experienced disgust or had the manipulation that was designed to induce disgust actually processed information less heuristically, engaged in less heuristic processing. But it has a positive relationship with perceived risks. So less heuristic processing means lower perceived risks as well. The other thing that was really interesting here and that I was really hoping to see is some significant interactions, right? So this is the interaction term where we use that manipulation discussed. We think about how it interacts with attention to news to influence these variables that we have, the mediating variable in particular. So actually, the only one that was relatively close to significance was the relationship on heuristic processing. But what I do for all these interactions is I further look into them with a particular technique. It's called the Johnson-Neyman technique, and it's a way to probe interactions that, again, this is for the social scientists in the room, but to probe interactions where the moderator variable has a continuous scale. And what it'll do is it'll give you a region, right? If there are significance regions on that scale, if that interaction is significant at any point on the moderator, you can tell that. And so what this looks like, right, so on the x-axis here we have attention to microbiome news, we have the outcome variable heuristic processing, and then the solid circles represent the disgust manipulation, the open circles the no disgust manipulation. And when you use the Johnson-Neyman technique, it gives you, again, a regions of significance along your moderating variable. And so an area, right, along attention to microbiome news where this interaction might be significant. And basically, what I found is that at very low attention to microbiome news, between 1 and 4.09 is where this interaction is significant. It's where that attention, where disgust matters, right? So only if you pay very little attention to news about this issue did that elicitation of disgust matter at all for heuristic processing. Realize I'm talking very quickly here. But so, just to sort of summarize, the research is a lot of technical statistical stuff, but to summarize sort of the takeaways from this. Also, I wanted to include an image about microbes in media, but when you Google microbes in media, if you know anything about microbiology, what you get is growth media. And so this is my little joke, possibly not that funny.
Nerd
yeah, it's kind of a nerdy joke. Okay, so, but from our content analysis, right, we know that 43% of the coverage about microbiomes online focuses on humans. About a third of our sample had 3 out of 4 indicators of scientific depth, so we could maybe say, the articles that people encounter online are relatively scientific. And the most included sort of indicator of how scientific an article was inclusion of some investigator or some researcher from a particular institution. In our survey research and our experimental research, right, I looked at support for regulating microbiome research and products. And so what we know is that if you elicit disgust and you have a human focus, people tend to be more supportive of regulating microbiome research and products. And then we know that there's also, right, perceived risks about microbiomes is related to how we process that information and related to disgust. But disgust really only matters for people who don't pay that much attention to information, right, about this issue. And all that served to decrease perceived risk, actually. Decrease, yeah. So, as with any research, there's limitations, right? So one of the things is how do we separate disgust, which is a discrete emotion, but also has this sort of negative valence to it, right? It comes with a negative feeling. So, basically what we did here is we didn't only measure disgust. We didn't just ask them, oh, how did this make you feel, right? How disgusted or how distasteful did you feel about this particular article? But we also measured things like anger and fear, right? And through, basically through factor analysis, you can say, well, these are separate things, and they experience disgust. The other thing is that the information processing that we measured was on a validated scale. And so it's basically a self-reported scale of information processing. You're asking them, presenting respondents various statements and asking them how much they agree or disagree with the statements, right? But there are other ways to do that, right, that we're working on. We had some thought listing. We haven't analyzed those data yet. We have some thought listing, and then there's also response latency. So how long it takes them to answer a particular question after being exposed to that stimulus, right? These are some other indicators of information processing that will likely include in future iterations of this study. But that's all great, and that's sort of the most recent project that I've been working on. But there's also other things that we can do, especially with emotion. And so one of the things that I want to do is manipulate the vividness of that manipulation, right? To think about, are there degrees of disgust that then elicit different types of processing that change how we perceive the risks, change how we support regulation of it, right? So is it not just like no disgust or disgust, but various shades of disgust, let's call it that. And so we recently acquired some software and some technology that allows us to recognize emotions with just a webcam and facial recognition. And so I'm sort of thinking of how I can use this particular software. It's called Affectiva. But to think about, to calibrate, right, our vividness of disgust, so the shades of disgust, basically. The other thing we have along with that is biophysical measurements, so skin conductance, right, and these can also be used as outcome variables in addition to the survey research that we've done, so combining biophysical measurements as well as social science surveys. But then also thinking of disgust as a dependent variable. The experiment that I ran was designed to elicit disgust. I made the text such that it would elicit disgust, right? But how much of this actually happens when you encounter something online? So thinking about disgust as a dependent variable and trying to find the disgust eliciting elements in sort of the real world, right? In the field, which is basically articles about this issue online. So that's sort of the next steps for this particular project. Other projects that I'm currently working on in this next year, we have this program called the Honors Humanities Professorship at the University of Utah, and I'm the Honors Humanities Professor for next year, and I'm going to be working on humor in science communication with some colleagues who actually were also here. Mike Cacciatore, I think you guys met a couple weeks ago, who came and talked about vaccines, probably. And Leona Su, who's a graduate and is now at the University of Utah as well. So we've been working on humor in science communication, and this was sort of a preliminary pilot experiment that we ran, where it's the same sort of context, right? Recruiting subjects, but one of them is funny and one of them is not. I noticed that no one's laughing, so maybe you guys don't think it's that funny, which is cool. And also, so not only framing the humor in these communications, but also how social norms influence that humor, right? So interactions between humor and social norms. And then, the last thing, in addition to sort of doing the theoretical stuff on this project, is we're trying to work with a science and technology museum in Salt Lake City. It's called the Leonardo, to work and see whether humor in practice, right? So not only can we do the theoretical work in science communication, but the practical work is also important. Because we started this talk with, discussing public opinion gaps, right? And thinking about how to better communicate science. Presumably, most of us are here and getting a minor in science communication because we think it's important and we want to better communicate science, right? And so reaching out to practitioners in this area is also really important. Long term, my interest is in information seeking and processing, and this is what I think in a lot of boxes and lines, I guess. So this is sort of my next steps moving forward career-wise and thinking about, theoretically, about how to communicate science and how various elements of communication and individual motivations or predispositions influence our attitudes towards science. Thank you for your time.